Let's turn in our Bibles to Revelation chapter 12. I've been very eager to get to this point because my favorite part of Revelation is from 12 on. All the rest of it is equally interesting and valuable, but it gets down to some really interesting things at this point. And so we're going to see, I just want to review with you the grayed out areas on your notes are where we've already been, right? So I don't want to read all through that, but we've seen the scene in heaven, we've seen the scene on earth. During the tribulation, starting with chapter 6, we have the 7 seals, and then later we did the 7 trumpet judgments, except for the 7th one, which we need to look at today. I'm actually going to have us back up to that. And parenthetical explanations that we got into about God's program and the scroll that John was to eat and the 2 witnesses, who they might be and what they'll be doing and so on. Now we come to another portion, and it could be a sidebar also, like the interlude part was, but these things take place at the midpoint of the tribulation. And so that's really probably right where the flow of the 7 seals, which took us all the way through Revelation, the 7 trumpets took us probably just up to the midpoint of the tribulation, except for the 7th trumpet, which we're going to read about in a minute. So the 6 seals did that. And now we're at that midpoint. So let's back up just a little bit to the 7th trumpet, which we didn't actually do last time, from the previous chapter, chapter 11 and verse 15. And in fact, verse 14 before that, I need to read that too in the context of what we're doing. After the 6th trumpet, it says the 7th woe has passed, the 3rd woe is coming soon. Okay, so the 5th trumpet was the first woe, the 6th trumpet was the second woe. You would assume that the 7th trumpet would be the 3rd woe, but there's a question about that. So let's just keep that in mind right now. Let's look at what happens at the 7th trumpet. The 7th angel sounded his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven which said, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever." And the 24 elders who were seated on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, "We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, the one who is and who was, because you have taken your great power and have begun to reign. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come. The time has come for judging the dead and rewarding your servants the prophets, and your people who revere your name, both great and small, and for destroying those who destroy the earth." Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the Ark of the Covenant, and there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and a severe hailstorm. So what is this 7th trumpet? Well, it says plainly that it is the beginning of the kingdom age. Okay, the beginning of the future. Even if you don't look for a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ, it's going to be the new heaven and the new earth then. But we'll see later on, when we get to chapters 19, 20, 21, 22, that when Christ comes back to end the battle of Armageddon, that's a short, horrible war. And then he sets up his kingdom immediately. And according to the next chapter, there's a 1,000-year reign of Christ. And after that, a new heaven and a new earth. So that seems to be what the 7th trumpet is really all about, is that glorious future, a happy ending after all this other stuff. But what about the 3rd woe? You know, that doesn't sound like a 3rd woe, does it? But there were parts in there that reminded us that there was that battle of Armageddon, okay, and that there's judgment of the wicked in order to start a new and glorious kingdom, you know. And so there's 2 main views about the 3rd woe. One is, and I'm kind of okay with either one. One is that the 3rd woe is the battle of Armageddon, which is just implied, and the future kingdom and new heaven and new earth. In other words, all the rest of it from the battle of Armageddon on. Because there are things said in what we just read about tragedy and destruction too, right? But another possibility is that the third woe is actually the characters that we're going to see in chapter 13 especially. Okay, because we have the unholy trinity, and that's what we'll be studying next. The unholy trinity and the earthly rulers that are terrible during that time, and the mark of the beast, you know. So that could be the third woe. And unlike most of the rest of Revelation, it doesn't say clearly which it is. So I just kind of want to lump it all together and say that the seventh trumpet is the third woe, because it brings the mark of the beast and everything up to Armageddon, but it results in the kingdom. But I can understand the point of view that others are saying the third woe is going to be human agents that are Antichrist and the false prophet, and they're energized by the devil, the unholy trinity. So we'll just keep that in mind, and we won't have what I consider a conclusive answer to what is the third woe, but it's probably one of those two things at least. It's the rest of the future of the book. So getting to chapter 12 now, and by the way, you'll see that so many of the things that we just read in those many verses at the end of chapter 11 are things that we've already studied, so we don't have to answer who are the 24 elders and where is this place in heaven and all of that, right? But when we get to chapter 12, we have the role of Israel in the tribulation. And I know that I mentioned early on that once the church is gone, everything is about Israel in the book of Revelation from about chapter 4 on. And this chapter 12 really kind of zeroes in on that. This is the time of Jacob's trouble from the Old Testament, 7-year period of tribulation that goes along with a peace treaty that is talked about in Daniel. We're going to go back and look at Daniel chapter 9 today. So it is, this period of angst here on the earth and destruction and all of that. But Israel is the key player because the church is gone, right? And the question came up earlier, and I think it's a great question: is there still a church on earth during the tribulation? Well, I think there will be lots of places that are called a church and organizations that are churches, but they'll more and more become part of an ecumenical movement toward a one-world religion, which the world is going to see as the only hope for doing away with these horrible wars, is to have a one-world religion. And believe me, this is coming on strong right now. You can find all kinds of news about that, and otherwise good people who are saying, oh, let's see what we can do with the Muslims, to express the fact that we worship the same God, so don't worry about it. Don't be evangelistic to each other, and bring the other religions in while you're at it, and let's have let's worship the earth. Let's have the new age, So, and believe me, it's getting stronger and stronger all the time.
Yeah.
And since we're seeing all these other things, I expect to see this really start to come to a head. And I'm afraid that it's probably going to be led by Pope Francis. And if not, he's at least a heavy voice in all of that, because he's already talking that way. I've given you some articles, and so we can keep looking and praying, and it surely doesn't have to be that way. He could be, because when he first became Pope, this is just a little side note, but when he first became Pope, we pointed out at the time to readers and so on that he is the last Pope of Malachi's prediction, which may or may not be true anyway, but let's say it is true, and let's say he is the last Pope. What is said about him isn't evil. It says that he's valiantly trying to keep the religion from falling apart, but he presides over it at the time that Rome is destroyed, and that's that last prediction. So I'm sure his intentions are good, and he may be considered by everybody except some of us as the hope of the world, really, for uniting the religions and bringing peace to the earth. So anyway, this is what's coming, is a one world religion, and Israel is still very, very much in the spotlight. So let's start reading about the birth of the deliverer, verses 1 to 6, and especially the purpose for Israel in the first two verses. Chapter 12, verse 1. a great sign appeared in heaven. And a sign means there's something symbolic about this, right? There's all kinds of signs in Revelation. And they all have a meaning that usually is explained somewhere in the book. A great sign appeared in the heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon, and under her feet a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. And then as we go on into this, we'll see that the one who was born is the Messiah. Okay? And so at this point, even the time of the writing of Revelation, that's past history, right? But it's important past history, extremely important. And so it's brought up that this is the hope of Israel, the prayer of every Jewish mother is that she could give birth to the Messiah. This actually happened. And so different interpretations about who this woman might be. The Catholic Church says plain and simple, it's Mary, because she gave birth to Jesus. Well, who can debate that? But on the other hand, this is a sign, okay? Mary's symbolic of all of Israel giving birth to a Messiah. And the Messiah is a gift to the world. So from that point of view, the woman could be something else. Some people say it's the church, but that doesn't fit either, according to the things that we've taught already. The most likely thing is that the woman is Israel, and this is backed up by the fact that it talks about these sun and moon and stars, because that takes us in our study to Genesis 37. Let's turn there. And there's these two dreams that Joseph had that made him persona non grata in his family. He couldn't help the dreams, though. God gave them to him. I guess he could have kept them to himself. But in chapter 37, verse 5, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." But his brothers were already jealous of him. They don't like him anyway. And then he has this dream. It's just in your face. So his brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. But then there's this dream, which is really the one that's referred to in Revelation 12. Verse 9. Verse 9, then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Not making things better, is he? When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Well, did this ever happen? Yes. Sure it did. When they were captive, and before they were captive, the way that they ended up being captive in Egypt was because of the famine in the land. And by then, they had sold Joseph as a slave, and he, being as godly a person as he was, had risen to the second most important position in the world, and was in control of feeding the world, basically, with this famine. And his brothers kept coming to him to get food, but they didn't know it was him. It didn't look like it, didn't sound like, they didn't think he was alive. So it wasn't until the end, after he had kept Benjamin, the youngest one, for a while in prison, that he finally revealed himself to them, and they were terrified. They thought, surely he's going to kill us, but he didn't. He was godly, and what he did instead was to bring his whole family down into Egypt. But after 400 years of being in Egypt, they were slaves and had to have the Exodus, right? So, but anyway, this is where that imagery comes from, and there's nothing else like it in the Bible that would make you think that's what this symbolism is all about. So it's about Joseph's dream, which was really all about Israel, okay? And Israel, his father, Jacob, was named Israel, was the father of the 12 tribes. Okay, that's where the 11 other stars and so on. And so this is about Israel, plain and simple. Revelation 12 is talking about Israel giving birth to her Messiah. And then, verse 2, another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Now this couldn't be anybody but Jesus, right?
That's right.
So you can't blame anybody for thinking the woman was Mary. I think the woman was Mary also, but in symbolism, it's Israel.
Yeah.
Okay. Israel is in view here. This is an Israeli phase. It's their last, Jacob's trouble. It's the last 7 years of human history before Christ comes to reign. So, in our outline, we're at the miraculous history of Israel. I have 4 segments that I want to just read through and make brief comments during our lesson today about the miraculous history of Israel. And up to this point, we can look back and say the miraculous history of Israel in the Old Testament. And most of you know this history, so I'll just read it, make brief comments, and then if we have questions later, write them down. Hopefully I'll stop earlier today and we can have questions. What we mean by the miraculous history of Israel in the Old Testament is before Jacob and the 12 tribes. Okay. First of all, there's sin and salvation in Genesis 3. There's a curse on Canaan, which turns out to be important because after the flood, when one of the 3 sons of Noah made fun of him because he accidentally got drunk. Remember that? Genesis 9. There was a curse put on that one son, Ham, but it was specifically for Ham's son, Canaan, which is really interesting because when I was a young Christian, people were still saying that the reason that black people have had such a hard time and were in slavery and this and that was because of the curse on Ham, because Ham went down to Africa and most of the black people were descendants of his. But Canaan didn't go down to Africa and wasn't black, probably dark skinned, but not black. Canaan went to the land of Canaan. That's why it's called Canaan, okay? It's one of the closest places to Mount Ararat when they started to spread out. They went there and they were ungodly people who sacrificed their children to foreign gods and eventually had to be wiped out, just like the people before the flood. And God knew all this ahead of time. And it came though from that bad idea that Ham had that must have somehow been transmitted through his family, whether genetically or otherwise, to Canaan. So Canaan will be cursed. And that's exactly what happened when they lost their land to Israel. You see what I'm saying? I mean, that answers why, because when God gave this land to them, it was already populated, but it was populated by people who had become evil again in record time. And it was the Canaanites. And so Israel had to wipe out the Canaanites. God did most of the wiping out. And it was because of their sin. But anyway, that's important because the curse on Canaan legitimizes Israel taking the land, if you follow me on that. Mm-hmm. And then the call of Abraham is huge because Abraham is the forefather of not only the Jewish people but also the Muslims. Okay. But that call was that through his seed, which would be Messiah, all the nations of the world would be blessed. And then the birth of Isaac, Abraham's son, because we're talking about miracles here. I mean, there's a miracle in all of these things, and I'm not going into great detail, but if you don't already know the miracle part of the story, you could find it easy enough. But with the birth of Isaac, and then later the birth of his sons, there were miracles involved that God brought about. Their birth after the wife was too old and other things. And then the birth and life of Jacob was also miraculous. His life was miraculous. His wrestling with the angel, his calling to be the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, his new name. The Exodus was very miraculous, was it not? Moses and the burning bush was amazing. The plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, their provision in the wilderness, this is the mother lode of miracles in the Bible, really, is that part of the Bible. And then the conquest of Canaan, that was all miraculous too. How was Jericho conquered? By the walls falling down, you know. That was God's doing. The people didn't do it, they just obeyed the Lord. The Lord made the walls fall down. And then he fought most of their other battles going into Canaan. So miracles, miracles, miracles. In the time of the judges, I've just picked out one example, Samson. His life was miraculous. And his death was miraculous. David and Solomon's time, the fight with Goliath was miraculous. Solomon's wisdom is miraculous. And the time of Elijah, Mount Carmel, he called down fire from heaven. That God told him to do it. It wasn't his idea, but it was miraculous. And then the captivities and the restorations, you know, the stories of Daniel, for instance, during the captivity, and the story of Esther later on during the captivity. These are oozing with the miraculous, right? So when people today talk about the miracle of Israel becoming a nation, which is, we'll get to it later on, but we can't do much justice to it time-wise. But there are so many miracles involved that this is actually being used by Jewish converts to Yeshua, the Messiah, as a proof to other Jewish people that, that Jesus is the one, you know. So it's really pretty exciting stuff. In verse 3 we come to the plan of the devil. I think I started to read that already. Another sign. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns on its head. This comes up again in the next chapter where we have the mark of the beast, the unholy Trinity, and that sort of thing. But to let the Bible explain what the 7 heads are and the 10 horns, we need to turn to chapter 17, which we'll study again later, of course. But do that with me, if you will. I'm going to mention other places, but we don't always have to turn. But this one you at least want to listen as I read 17, verse 9. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. And the beast who once was and now is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. Now if you just start reading right there, you're as confused as you can be anywhere in the Bible, right? But if you've been wondering for several chapters already, what's the 7 heads and the 10 horns all about? Then he says the 7 heads are 7 major kings, kingdoms, empires. There's 7 world empires. Nebuchadnezzar's statue started with the 3rd one. The golden head of Babylon was the 3rd. Before that, there was Egypt and Assyria. Okay? So you have Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. That's how many? 5. It says here, 5 have come, and 1 is. What would the next one be? Rome. Rome existed at the time of the writing of the Revelation. Okay. And then it goes on to talk about what's going to happen beyond that. So we're into the tribulation and beyond by the time it explains what and the 10 horns are, the way you should picture this is 10 horns on the 7th head. Not 1 on each one and some of them having 2 or 3, but 7 horns on the 10th head, which would almost surely be interpreted as an origin of 10 nations that bring this thing into existence. And for that reason, people were extremely interested in the European Union's formation, as it started with, just 6, and then it got up to 9, and then Greece became the 10th one, and prophecy scholars were saying, ooh, me too. Now it's what, 27, 29, and went way past that. But it had to start somewhere. And at the point of 10, they had an organization that was only recently disbanded that was the original 10 nations that stood for the defense of the European Union. And now they don't need it because they've changed everything. But it did start with 10 nations, And Hal Lindsey came to our church before he was a writer. I was in my 20s myself, and he was about my age. He was in charge, did I tell you this before? He was in charge of the Light and Power House, which is a Campus Crusade club at UCLA. And I had a student from my church in East LA that was going to UCLA and knew him. And she said, you know, there's this guy that's in charge of our club that just came back. He's actually a photographer, but he's serving the Lord with Campus Crusade. And he went as a photographer to Europe and took all these pictures of the European Union, and he's dying to tell somebody about it. Could he come to our church and tell? Oh yeah, I guess so. We'll take a chance. Wow. So he came and showed his picture. At that time there were only 6 flags, but there were 10 flagpoles in a circle and 1 in the center for the personal, you know, the beast when he comes around. They probably don't have the same flagpole arrangement anymore, but that's what he took pictures of and came and talked about this to us, and it was pretty electrifying at that. So anyway, that's not the only possibility, but it certainly is a possibility, isn't it? Let's go back to this 7-headed beast and what he's doing in chapter 12. He's not happy about the child being born, right? I read that the child was snatched up to God. It says, the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment he was born. Is there anything in biblical history that reminds you of? What's that?
Well,
see, the spiritual warfare is so important to see spiritual warfare in every phase of biblical history and in every phase of our own personal life. Spiritual warfare is always going on. The devil's always trying to destroy God's plan. And it's in our lives and it's there. And so the plan then that the devil had, can't stop him from being born, but I'm going to let Herod find out that where he's supposed to be born, and that way he can go in and wipe out all the children. But it didn't work, of course, because the angel told Joseph, get out of town before Herod's troops arrive. So anyway, that's history that's fulfilled at this point. And the child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Did that happen? Yeah. Well, it was like 33 years later. Yeah. But there was spiritual warfare and protection and the battle, and of course the Son of God isn't going to be defeated by that red dragon during his lifetime. If he couldn't be destroyed as a baby, you know, he made it to the end, and then the devil thought he destroyed him on the cross, but he was resurrected, and then he rose into heaven. He was snatched out of here. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Now this is the point where I think past history changes to future history. Because the tribulation is 7 years long. It's during a peace treaty that's talked about in Daniel 9. I'm going to have you turn there in just a second. But at the midpoint of that peace treaty, 3.5 years, it's broken by the abomination of desolation, which is the devil setting up his Antichrist to be worshipped, and the mark of the beast, which is now going to be economic control by the enemy of the whole world. So hold your place here for a moment and just turn with me quickly to Daniel 9, in case you don't know about this. Of course, the whole book of Daniel is parallel to the book of Revelation, big time. Actually, I don't want to get into all the details of this Daniel's 70 weeks, but I want to start reading it and then skip down to the last verse. Verse 25 of Daniel 9. Know and understand this, from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. Anyway, if you study this, which we won't take the time to do right now because it takes a while, as a prophecy that there will be 70 weeks of something. A week is a seven sum of something. You know, you could use week to be 7 of anything, really. But so if there are weeks of years, you know, and that sort of thing, then 70 times 7 would be 490 years, right? And in the 1800s, Sir Robert Anderson wrote a book called The Coming Prince. Many of you have heard of that, probably, right? He was head of Scotland Yard, so he was no slouch, right? He wrote this book where he said, from that decree, which was issued by Artaxerxes Longimanus, using lunar years, which is what's always the case in the Bible, it was exactly 483 years to the day from that decree until Jesus entered Jerusalem to offer himself as king. But he was cut off because the crowd wanted him, but the leadership wouldn't have him. Okay, and that leaves, not only is that an unbelievable fulfillment in history of a time range, but it leaves that 7 years for the future. And so Daniel talks about this, or the book of Daniel does, in the last verse of this chapter. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So this is that 7-year period of future, broken in half by the abomination of desolation. They thought it happened during the Maccabees. That was a type of the same thing. And there are other ways that people have looked at this, good Bible teachers, but if you take it the way we're teaching it, that last 7-year has not yet been served, but it's the 7 years of the tribulation. And you have all these places in Revelation where they talk about the second half of it as 3.5 years, or 42 months, or 1,260 days. They're all the same. Okay. And I think that's for emphasis, so that you say something special about those 3.5 years, right? Well, yeah, it's the Great Tribulation. So that takes us to the miraculous history of Israel. Let me just back up a little bit. These are all miraculous things that happened. The birth of the Messiah, the protection of the baby Jesus, Jesus' death and resurrection, the gospel to Israel first and then to the Gentiles, signs and wonders, which was the initial proof to people that Christianity was true, the conversion of Paul, and then I like to throw in Palestine, because Palestine is kind of a problem to Israel, but the name was given right after the period of our Lord's life, when the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, and then after that they wanted to make sure that the Jewish people didn't come back. They said, we're giving it to the Philistines. The Philistines of the Old Testament used to live here, so that's who owns this land, not the Jews. And so they call it Palestine. Isn't that weird? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot to that. I think I'm going to jump ahead to the miraculous history of Israel in our generation, and I wish we had another whole session to do this, because there's hundreds of things that have happened miraculously to bring Israel into existence in our generation and to keep them in power. I just want to read you the short list. The Zionistic movement, which came at the end of the 1800s. This had to have been motivated by God's knowledge that the time was ripe for Israel to go back to her land. That Ezekiel 36 and 37 are the fulfillment, or the prophecy of Israel going back to the land. And there hasn't been any other culture in human history that's been expelled from their land for any length of time, like more than 5 generations, that ever was able to come back to their own land and possess it. But this did happen for Israel, and here are some of the miracles that made it happen. The Balfour Declaration, where the kind of like head of state, is a different title, of England, said the Jewish people need to have a homeland, and so we, England, are in favor of a Jewish homeland, and that kind of set the scene for the possibility. And then the Holocaust, of course, the Holocaust first, where 6 million Jews were killed. And while they've been hated throughout history, unfairly, because they're good people, sometimes they were too rich or too prosperous or too intelligent or too something else, so people hate them for their goodness. And they're not all perfect either, but they're God's chosen people, and especially anointed and enabled and hated. And the worst sign of that hatred was the Holocaust, where 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. So after that, the Balfour Declaration, and then on the very day that England gave up their mandate over Israel and Jordan, Israel declared independence on that very day. And that same day, 5 nations around them declared war against them, all their neighbors.
Yeah, that's right.
And they were outnumbered astronomically, and they didn't have the weapons. There's even some old movies about people dropping Molotov cocktails out of old-fashioned airplanes that are flying around. But somehow God let them win that first war. Amazing.
Yeah.
And then they won all these other wars that have happened since then, won or survived. In 1953 was the Suez War. 1967, the Six-Day War. That's the most incredible. And Neville and I have been talking about that, and he feeds me information. A lot of it I knew before, but it's so great to just see it again. You know, I'll just give you the main thing about that. They knew that their neighbors were going to attack them again in the near future, but they didn't know what to do about it because it should have been a massacre against Israel. They had MiGs and tons of them, you know, and so many soldiers, so many tanks. Israel had actually decided they were going to lose 20 to 30,000 people when the war came. But the Lord arranged it for them, and you have to give credit to their military strategy too, of course, but God gave them their military strategy. To go in on a particular time when nobody expected it, with their few, all but 8 or 12 of their airplanes, which weren't great anyway. Okay, I think that were they French Mirages or something like that. But they flew low, like 200 feet, so the radar couldn't pick them up. And they all left for their targets in various places at the same moment. And it had to be the exact moment, and they didn't know before when it would be. I read a book by one of the pilots. He said, you know, this is strange stuff, you know. All of a sudden we're told, go and do this. And what most of them were told to do is to go to Cairo and bomb the Egyptian airport there, and then, because they assumed they'd be successful, come back and bomb it again and again. And they did that. And so it was a 6-day war started with this. Actually, the war started on their Independence Day when the Egyptian president, Nasser, mobilized forces to march toward Israel. And the whole Islamic world was all excited about, this is it, you know. And then this happens, and I think it was at night too, I'm not sure. Dead or night?
7:15 in the morning.
So, okay.
That's when they
First light, okay? First light, so they could at least see what they were bombing. But anyway, they were so successful, they didn't lose any of their planes, and they took out all of Egypt's planes. And they ruined the runways by coming back a second and third time to bomb the runways. And so it was a 6-day war, but actually the war was won in the first 6 hours. Yeah. So the hand of God had to be on that. That's all there's to it. They had Yom Kippur War in 1973 while they were celebrating Holy Day. They did the Entebbe raid in '76, where more than 100 of their people, in a flight of 200 and some people, were hijacked and taken to Entebbe in Uganda. In the days of Idi Amin, the monster. You know, Benjamin Netanyahu's brother, Yoni, right, led 100 commandos from Israel to Uganda, and they got all of those people out alive, but Yoni lost his life. And then I just wanted to throw in, I don't think it's in your notes, but they destroyed the world's, they destroyed the Syriac nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981, and in the 2000s they've destroyed 2 or 3 Syrian nuclear reactors. And I just have to see miracles in all of that, because nobody else would dare to do any of that stuff. So they do it, and God allows it and protects them, and you know, so miracle, miracle, miracle. Let's move down to the battle with the devil, verse 7. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Has that already happened? It seems like he's still accusing the brethren in Job, you know, and that sort of thing. But it will happen at this time. He's gonna, no more access to heaven, no more accusing the saints up there. Cast down to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now has come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heaven, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. It looks like this is going to happen about the time that in the next chapter we see Antichrist has set up an image of himself and asks people to worship it, imposes the mark of the beast, begins the second half of the 7 years, which is the Great Tribulation. And then the devil knows 3.5 years isn't a very long time. And so is he ever angry? Verse 13, when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman, this is Israel now, who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time. There's a fourth way of saying 3.5 years. Out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river, and the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged, and the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. We won't know for sure how some of this plays out until we see the video in heaven. But a lot of people believe that this is when they flee to Basra and Petra area, because when Jesus returns, and we'll talk about this at his return in 19, he actually goes with bloodstained garments from the Battle of Armageddon to Basra to collect the Jewish people that are there. Basra and Petra are the same basic area. And a lot of people say, well, you know, in terms of modern technology and warfare, they wouldn't be protected in Petra. They wouldn't all fit in Petra. You could just bomb them. That's the way we do these days. Well, yeah, all that's true. But whatever, this is going to be another miracle, another supernatural protection. It says right here it's going to be supernatural, doesn't it? You know, the Lord protects them. And it's really interesting because, I won't give it to you right now, but there's passages about the land that Antichrist really takes over in the book of Daniel, and Moab is accepted. For some reason, he can't take over Moab. Little old Jordan. Part of Jordan. And that's where Petra and Basra are. Okay, I'm going to stop there.